So good morning, good afternoon, colleagues online, and thank you very much for joining us for this third in the series of the annual results report briefings for 2017. I know for colleagues who've, Lena, thank you very much for joining us again with your colleagues from Swedish SIDA. And we have others who are joining in online, so we will be making a round of quick introductions very soon. But for those in the room, you've probably heard me over and over twice, so please bear with me while I say a couple of opening remarks as we get all the colleagues online connected. So as I said, it's the third in the series. Since this morning, we've had two sessions, one on child protection and the second one on humanitarian action. We typically have these meetings in person on the sides of the Executive Board annual session, but this time we are giving it a try through a virtual meeting, and let's give it a good shot and make this work. And we've had good experiences for the last two sessions, so really looking forward to this third one. For those of you who have joined us new, just to say that the session has a threefold purpose. Of course, recognizing that the global thematic funding pool is a very important multi-year flexible funding for UNICEF that complements the regular resources. And together they are extremely instrumental in achieving the results for children as outlined in our strategic plan. So this today's session is specifically focusing on the 2017 results through the global thematic funding pools, which was in the period of our last strategic plan, 2014 to 2017. And the threefold purpose for each of the sessions, as we dive deep into each of the 8 global thematic funding pools for the last strategic plan period, is A, first of all, take stock of what the key results achieved have been. B is looking at the impact on the lives of children and families. And C is also to take stock of lessons learned that are going to help us in the implementation of the new strategic plan, which is 2018 to 2021. On that note, that said, we will do a quick round of introductions. I should have said at the onset, I'm Mandeep O'Brien, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Public Partnerships Division, and I'll be moderating this session here today. Maybe we start with our colleagues online with introductions, and then followed by colleagues here in New York. Lena Forsgren and colleagues have joined us from Swedish SIDA. I understand colleagues from NORAD have also joined us. Please feel free to unmute your microphones and introduce yourselves in case I have missed any other colleagues who've joined us by telephone and not by Skype. Okay, so if not, we'll just do a quick round here in New York. And for those who've joined us by Skype, you have the instant messaging, and we are picking it up real time here in New York. So I'll start from my right-hand side. Please.
Hi, my name is Manuela Cusadulu, and I'm from the Permanent Mission of Bridge.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Fatima from the Permanent Mission of Senegal.
Hi, I'm Mira Bergen from the Danish Mission to the UN.
Good morning, Marike Vreke from the Netherlands Mission to the UN.
Hello, I'm Lies Kazoli and I'm from the Belgian Mission.
Oh, sorry. Jo Bourne, Associate Director, Education. You'll hear a lot from me in a minute.
Jonas Kanchan from Public Partnership Division.
Amy Blummy from Education.
And Hannah from Education.
Fernando Tiracini, Public Partnerships.
Medina, Public Partnerships.
Cecilia Fantoni, Public Partnerships.
Yunus Haidar from Education.
Matt Brossan from Education.
Peter de Vries, Education.
Gemma Wilson-Clark, Education.
Maria Jane, Public Partnerships.
And Marco from education.
Thank you very much. I see that someone has joined us from Spain as well. So in case you joined us by phone, please feel free to introduce yourself. Okay.
Someone's saying that they can't hear yet.
You can't hear?
Is that Lynette? I saw something come up.
Well, they should be able to.
Could you write
Yes,
back?
yeah.
I'm writing back right now.
Can no one hear us?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's Cecilia.
From New York.
Okay. Okay, so
Okay, Sabine, can
Okay.
you hear us?
Okay. Maybe make sure your speaker is on. There's no sound.
okay. So let's get started, and for colleagues who are having any difficulty in hearing us, please do use the instant messaging and alert Cecilia and the team, and then we'll try to sort out if there's any technical difficulty. So for those of us who are here in New York, we will need to look at the camera. And for convenience, actually, the team has put some animals and some figures there so that we can look into it. So that makes it more interactive as a session, hopefully. So just in terms of format for this session, we're going to hand over in a minute to Joe Bond to walk us through a presentation on the results of the Education Global Thematic Fund. And we have around 10 to 15 minutes for that. Whereafter we will open the floor for question, answers, and some interactive dialogue. For colleagues online, just to encourage you to, if you have questions, comments, points of reflection, please do use the instant messaging and flag them as we move along. And our team here will be collating those and just in time for the plenary session following the presentation. So over to you, Joe.
Okay, thank you very much. It's going to be very strange to talk to plastic figures over here whilst there's a room over here. My son is an ice hockey player, so I'm going to pretend that that's him over there on the camera. And thank you very much for joining us. And before I start, I also want to say thank you to the team that has worked on the overall results report, some of whom are in the room today, and particularly I think Amy, Hannah, who have pulled everything together. So it's quite a mammoth undertaking to come up with a single report, and I hope that this short presentation does the overall report justice. So I'll dive straight in with the global context for education. Many of you will be familiar with this. Who's clicking for me? Thank you. You will be aware, of course, that there has been very good progress made in terms of getting children into school between 2000 and 2015, but despite this, there are still something like 260 million children who are not in school. It's worth highlighting in particular that includes 63 million primary school-aged children, and if you remember, of course, the MDGs were focused on primary. That means we still have unfinished business from the MDGs, as well as moving to a much more expansive sustainable development goal, which covers pre-primary, secondary, skills, tertiary, education for global citizenship and sustainable development. What we also know as we shifted from the MDGs to the SDGs, of course, was that we needed to focus more on two particular things. One was equity, and that, of course, includes the very many millions of children who are in conflict-affected situations and are not getting access to school, but also learning that an estimated 69% of children in low-income countries are not expected to learn basic primary level skills by 2030. So two areas where the SDG focuses, and there, of course, is where UNICEF might focus its attention as well. Just to say a little bit more about the challenges, I won't go over this too much. I've talked about the learning challenges. Large numbers of children, we estimate, not learning the basics in reading and mathematics. 51% of preschool age children not enrolled in early childhood education. Now this matters because when you start to think about what are the types of interventions you need in order to improve the learning of children, preschool education and good quality preschool education has dramatic impacts. So the fact that the most vulnerable children are not getting access to preschool means that they're starting at a massive disadvantage already. We also know, of course, that we've had an increase in the number of refugees and children who are uprooted due to various crises and conflict. 50% of those children are not in school. We know we have equity challenges for girls. We know we have equity challenges for children with disabilities, and we know that we are not necessarily on track in low-income countries to gain the types of skills that, of course, we're all talking about in terms of the global economy. One of the areas you'll see we won't talk so much about, but that's super important, is what we see is that with inequity is these are inequities within countries as well as between countries. So where you may see many countries where you will see average statistics improving, both in terms of learning and in terms of enrolment in school, it is still frequently the most marginalised children that are being excluded from that progress. So in the face of those big challenges, UNICEF, this is a very, very brief overview of some of the highlights that we've focused our attention on. We focus very much on system strengthening, data and evidence, new partnerships, innovation and advocacy around education. I'll pause briefly on system strengthening for anybody that glanced at the World Bank Human Development Report last year, or this year actually it was launched, focused solely on education, and the first time the bank has done a human development report focused solely on education. It pointed out a very strong linkage between strong education systems and improving learning. Of course, education systems is quite a difficult thing to think about because it doesn't look like immediate results, but we know that if you're going to really influence what happens within education for children, you need to be able to look at the domestic financing from governments and the way in which that financing is used and turned into learning outcomes for those children. Just some of the things that we've done then over the course of the last 4 years includes delivering education to 36.6 million children in emergencies. It is our fastest growing area of expenditure, which is perhaps somewhat of a sad thing to note. We've delivered learning materials to close on 60 million children in that time. We've been a very passionate advocate for increasing funding for education in emergencies, but also looking at things like how we can do a better job in terms of education in emergencies, including helping set up the new Education Cannot Wait Fund. We've also done a lot of, this is where it would fit into the data and evidence and advocacy work. We've supported 87 countries to increase the evidence they have at a national level on out-of-school children. These are the children who fall through the cracks, who are invisible or semi-visible, even in national data systems. And my colleague Mark over here is one of the people who's led that piece of work. Using those studies in 87 different countries, governments have had an opportunity to look at the policies within their own systems at targeting those children better. And this piece of work's actually just recently been evaluated, so that's one to watch out for coming up. On the learning side, we've also developed new tools for measuring learning through household surveys and also for analysing education systems. I think we're particularly pleased with the work that we've done on measuring foundational learning in household surveys. It's sort of the first time that that's ever been incorporated into a household survey of that nature, and it's likely to give us some really interesting and new data on the most vulnerable children. One of the countries that's been rolled out is North Korea. So whilst I doubt we'll actually get the data from North Korea, it's good that the government will have the data from North Korea in order to look at how the most vulnerable children are learning. A few more highlights. I talked about system strengthening. On the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see some examples of the type of work that we've done over the last 4 years, including improving the number of countries that have early learning policies and programs, helping countries improve their education management information systems, absolutely essential if you're going to be able to monitor the effectiveness of your system, helping countries put in place education policies for children with disabilities, and doing our best to make sure that that goes beyond a piece of paper, but is translated into action for children, and then helping countries where girls' education is lagging behind get that recognised, targeted and budgeted within national budgets. Overall, we've got pieces of work, and it's very difficult to summarise, but looking at work around bridging humanitarian and development divide, some of the shifts I think we've seen over the last 4 years. We've seen quite dramatic shifts around work with reaching children with inclusive education. I think we would probably say we're one of the leaders in the field in trying to move that work forward. We've increased our focus on learning and skills across the life cycle, and we've worked on strengthening data and evidence in education. We didn't hit all our targets, not really a surprise in some cases, but it's worth having a look and talking a little bit about why, and you'll see some of these in the reports. Why did we not miss some of those targets? Well, in some cases, they were overly ambitious. The nature of target setting is not an exact science. But then related to that, of course, even when we've got overly ambitious targets, we did still make progress on some. So a couple of examples. One is a target around countries with well-functioning student learning assessment systems. We started with a baseline of 42. We hit 61% by 2017, so we did see a dramatic improvement, but our target was 76%. So perhaps overly ambitious, given the nature of the work. It's not an easy thing to do necessarily. Another area where we saw good progress, but perhaps not where as much as we would have liked to have seen it, was around countries with effective mother tongue and multilingual education policies. Some of you will know that this is often quite a political issue, but from an evidence point of view, if you really want children to learn to read, then this is a very important policy and one of the most effective things that we could and should be doing. The reason this target was missed was largely due to lack of funding. Overall, our total spend was less than 1% on this. So despite only spending less than 1% on this, we did actually move from a baseline of 43 to 65, but the target was 54%. So that's just a couple of examples of how we feel that targets were missed, but you'll also notice, of course, that a lot of targets were also on track or achieved, and a few targets surpassed as well. A few numbers for 2017 now, rather than across the whole strategic plan. So 12.5 million children receiving learning materials, over 248,000 classrooms supplied with materials, over 47,000 school communities received training, and a note on that, but again, working with school communities, particularly around helping communities monitor what's happening in schools, reasonable evidence to show that that also supports improved learning outcomes and also improved learning environments. And reaching 8.8 million children in education in emergency situations last year. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our key programme areas now. There's 5 in total. So firstly, on the early learning, this is one of those areas where we've seen an increase, but we would like to see a greater increase. And we set ourselves a particularly ambitious target around trying to see an increase of the number of countries where more than 1 in 4 children from the poorest households were attending early childhood education. So very, very targeted on the most marginalised. And we certainly did see that increase from a baseline of 17 to 32% over the strategic plan period, but not as much as we want. So that's an area we'd like to continue focusing on. We do see an increasing number of countries that have programs focused on early learning, and we've also had a huge demand from many of our country offices. We did a survey last year to find out where was the demand for technical support, and this was one of the #1 areas was early learning, as governments are trying to tackle the idea of pre-primary education, but not necessarily having the technical advice, not knowing how to focus their financing, not knowing how to organise themselves in order to do that. So we've developed a conceptual framework to support this, which has been gradually rolled out. And in fact, I understand, because the lady from here is from Senegal, that actually it was being discussed in Senegal just a few weeks ago, this conceptual framework. However, we have seen a continued decrease in our own spending on early learning, and I'm going to come back to this at the end of the slide, at the end of the presentation, to sort of expand a bit on where and why we think. But it was 8.2% of our total education budget in 2014, and it's now 6% in 2017. So yet again, another red flag for us and a concern, given the evidence around both equity and learning. Moving on to learning, then I spoke earlier already about supporting countries to improve their learning assessment systems and also working with countries on mother tongue. We've also got a range, and some of you will be aware of the child-friendly schools approach, which is a range of different criteria, what you might call minimum quality standards in some countries, where governments have embedded these into national systems. So we have seen a steady increase of governments taking that idea moving forward. And then through some of these slides, we're going to throw in a few country examples, because of course we have a huge breadth of experience across the globe. Indonesia was one that caught our eye when we were doing the analysis this year, where we were working particularly on improving reading, and as a result of the interventions, the proportion of non-readers in target schools decreased from 62% to 27%, and the proportion of proficient readers with adequate reading and comprehension skills increased from 6 to 18%. And for both of those indicators, because this was done in a fairly rigorous way to evaluate the intervention, non-intervention schools did not show an improvement. That's also an example, I think, of how important it is to build evidence at the country level around what works in order to help countries and governments scale up. Moving on to equity then. This is kind of equity is such a big area of work, so girls and children with disabilities. We've also got work in this particular area around gender-based violence, and we've seen again an increase in the number of countries who have focused on gender-based violence in order to tackle that within schools. It's a particularly big reason to drive all children, but particularly girls, out of school. And actually in the coming year or so, you're going to be hearing more about this from us as we've partnered up with a few other agencies interested in this area, and we'll be campaigning more on reducing gender-based violence moving forward. Oh, sorry, just before I go on, I said there were a few areas where we've surpassed targets. So the areas where we've surpassed targets, one of them is innovation, and another area is actually gender-based violence, where we've seen much more movement from our country offices in trying to find local solutions to particular issues facing the most marginalised children. Education in emergencies, as you're probably aware, there's a big push around bridging the humanitarian development divide, and that's something that we've been taking quite seriously in the education space. And so work, for example, in Syria, where we've brought a number of partners together in order to be able to improve coordination across both our humanitarian response and the development and resilience or systems building responses. We've also worked with governments to develop risk-informed programming. I think this is quite an interesting one as well. We've had an increase in the number of countries that have a sector plan, but what we've noticed that have an up-to-date risk assessment and risk strategy within their sector plans. But of course, in working with partnership, this is not something that the Global Partnership for Education necessarily focuses on. So another area of work we've started doing with them is to develop new methodological guidelines that look at issues around risk and capacity building in order to move the dial a little bit faster on that. Another country example, I was actually in Bangladesh and in Cox's Bazar a few weeks ago with partners, it's quite amazing how quickly learning centres have been established. I have some wonderful photos on my phone of children who are really enjoying the learning experience that they're having there, but it's also incredibly difficult to move those experiences from a joyful learning experience to also something that is more meaningful for those children. So there is much to be done there, both on the expansion of the response and on embedding better quality into the response, and that's something that we are partnering with the University of Cambridge in seeing how we can help with that. System strengthening, I've spoke about a couple of times so already, so important bits of movement around strengthening education management information systems, training school management committees, and then you'll see in the right hand corner a piece of work that we've done in the Philippines to help the government develop a teacher hardship index, which is to enable the government to make choices around how it wants to focus teachers in some of the hardest and most challenging areas. As an important part of addressing questions around who is teaching the most marginalised children and how can we improve those learning experiences for those children in that country. I've also mentioned partnerships in here, and of course I've mentioned Education Cannot Wait because we were a key partner in establishing that over the period, and now sit on its governance body and host it. But of course there are a range of other partnerships that we are actively engaged in, and I'm now going to apologise because of the slide length of this presentation. I didn't put all of them in, so I'm going to mention of course the United Nations Girls Education Initiative, GPE, Educate a Child, the Education Commission, and a number of others both across the private and bilateral sphere. So this afternoon I'm off to go and spend the rest of the day with the Lego Foundation where we'll be looking at learning through play. So a number of partnerships that we work on that are important for us there. Lessons learned. To be honest, this is the same slide I used last year because it's still relevant. We recognise the importance of system strengthening, of acting on evidence and working in partnership. Those are three areas that guide a lot of the work that we do. In terms of where we think we have an added value, some of the things we're already doing around humanitarian development, multilingual, bilingual, focusing on the hardest to reach and lowest performers, increasing and targeting our funding to those children. We think those are things that we are reasonably good at. And where we would like to certainly strengthen our responses is to continue to focus on system strengthening, early learning. Learning is obviously key and also not easy to do, so we've been trying to sharpen some of our approaches to learning, including of course measuring learning, and recognising that teacher methods and effectiveness is a huge part of that. So my colleague Eunice at the back here is working now with a number of partners on various teacher initiatives to see how we can begin to shift the dial in terms of teacher practice. I wanted to focus just briefly, I'm going to take a quick drink. Have a quick look at this slide while I take a sip. Now, on the left-hand side, it shows all education funding for 2017, and that should be actually quite a big circle, and it's in comparison to the circle on the right-hand side, because the circle on the right-hand side I think is about 20% of the total. No, less? Thank you.
89 million out of 1.2 billion.
Yeah, you can do that in your head.
No, I mean, you have for last year, the total for education spending is 1.2 billion, as you can see in the center of the circle on the left, and then thematic is 89 million. So it's more like 6-7%.
So this is important because it tells you a narrative around thematic funding in relation to the overall funding. What that means is that thematic funding, of course, we have a lot more flexibility over, whereas the rest of our funding, by and large, is more earmarked. It's particular donors or particular interests where they align, then we will be working with them. You'll see, and I'm just going to illustrate two pieces, and the early learning one is an important one, of course. If you look at all education funding, improving early learning last year, 5%, I thought it was 6%, but anyway, between 5 and 6% of all education funding went to early learning. If you look on the right side, where we as UNICEF have more control over what we do with that money, you'll see that we actually allocated 11% to early learning, because we're trying to shift it to closer to 10. That's the sort of benchmark we've set ourselves, including making an allocation mid-year of about $4.3 million specifically to countries working on early learning in order to try to redress what we saw was a particular issue in reduction of support for early learning. I think that's just an example of how, where we've seen a problem, we've used thematic funding to potentially try to address it. It's a smaller amount of funding, but its flexibility allows us to do things that perhaps more earmarked funding doesn't allow us to do. The other one to look at, of course, is education in humanitarian settings. It's a massive part of our overall spend, 40% last year, up from 30-something the year before. And like I said, sadly likely to increase simply because the numbers of children who are in these situations, it's a hard road to try to decrease those numbers. So of the total, very rightly so, we are obviously focusing on those most marginalised children. When you look at the thematic funding, you don't see quite so much from thematic funding on education in humanitarian settings, partly to offset the amount that we are spending of earmarked funds, but also to make sure that that money is spent on things that perhaps are less likely to be funded in earmarked funds. So things like surge capacity, support staff, the work that's done perhaps at headquarters to support the response in the field. We would then put our thematic funding in that smaller and more catalytic types of areas. Whereas on converse in thematic funding, you'll see a larger amount of money going towards partnerships and system strengthening, again, because we know that there's very strong evidence around these areas in terms of moving forward, but it's not as easy to raise earmarked funding for system strengthening, unfortunately. So it just gives you, I just wanted to give a bit of an example about how we try to use more flexible funding to work alongside the overall funding pattern that we have for education. And I think now, moving forward, last two slides now on, and then I'll stop, just on moving forward. You'll have seen this a number of times. So obviously we're now well into the first year of Goal Area 2, Every Child Learns, for our strategic plan, with a continuing focus on access for the most marginalised, on increasing learning, and increasing learning and skills, in particular focus on personal empowerment, active citizenship, employability and learning, so seeing learning in a broader way than just literacy and numeracy, noting that you of course build those skills across the life cycle from early childhood through to adolescence. Another big area that we've been working on since our new executive director has come into play, and I'm not sure if anyone's talked about this yet. Is this going to be the first time? Okay. Is the Young People's Agenda, which the Executive Director has come in and made her priority within the first few months that she's been here. So it's taken quite a lot of discussion in-house, as you can imagine. Targets focused on secondary age education. You'll notice the secondary age. That doesn't just mean secondary schools. It means children who you would normally expect to be in secondary schools, but many of whom are not, because we know the most marginalised adolescents may well have already been pushed out of the system, or may still be in primary, or never finished primary, or never entered. So secondary age recognises that we need to work both on secondary and helping secondary schooling to be more equitable, but also noting that there would need to be alternative pathways. Second area then is also skills development and training, recognising a whole wide range of different skills. I've probably got a picture of all the skills that we're working on. And then thirdly, girls and empowerment, and looking at ways in which we can increase the participation of youth in solutions themselves. What's also going to be a question, no doubt, if it hasn't come in, is the education strategy. So we are intending, and I talked about this last year, to have an education strategy for UNICEF that will take us till 2030. This is delayed. It's delayed largely because headquarters is somewhat overstretched, dealing with the new priorities of our executive director, and not necessarily an increase in staff. But we will be trying to move that forward over the course of the next few months. finally then, I have to say thank you to everybody, to our thematic donors. The Government of Norway, I know, is online, but really for everybody for their support for the work that we do in education.